And hello, folks. Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Little impromptu episode here as we are going to talk some IU tournament chances and maybe some other stuff as well. Wanted to hop on this. A lot's happened over the last couple of days in terms of where IU is located within the spectrum of the NCAA tournament, and obviously a big game this weekend for Indiana. So we're going to look at the bracketing. We're going to look at where things are at right now in terms of the most recent projections. We're going to look at what games are going to be important and what teams you want to root for as we go into conference championship week, as this is not a simple equation for this IU basketball team. It's going to be tricky, to say the least. They can make it a lot easier on themselves with the next result, but they still don't get totally out of the woods with that, and I'll explain why as we go through that. So we're going to dive into that. If you've got questions or comments, the easiest way to go about registering those is going on to YouTube, and you can leave comments there. We'll see them during the live chat and be able to add those as we go. I'm keeping an eye on X as well. You can always tweet a question at the Crimson Cast account there, and I'll be happy to answer it as they come in. So we're going to go ahead and dive in, and I'm going to say maybe one thing first before we get into the tournament stuff, and that is on the on the coaching front. I know there's been a lot of rumors. I just want to say this: like I'm pretty plugged in terms of the people I talk to, and what's fascinating about the last, I would say, 72 hours is after what felt like about a 5 or 6 day period of everybody kind of being chill about the coaching search rumors, stuff's been flying all over the place over the course of the last, especially 3 days. And, we've seen Brad Stevens rumors, which had looked like they were dead and buried, come back in a big way. We saw a bunch of stuff today. I just want to note for people that you'll know when something's happening for real. It's probably not going to be coming from the message boards or from the discords. It's probably going to be pretty clear and out of left field, because that's how all these IU coaching searches have gone. So just guard your heart, I guess would be what I would say, because I see a lot of people getting overly wrapped up in this bit of rumor or that bit of rumor, and people who claim to know things here or there. And this is something that I'm always, for IU fans, I'm just like, you never really know. And you'll oftentimes hear people who swear up and down that they know something, and then that won't happen. They'll be like, well, things change at the last minute. And it's like, well, okay, sure, whatever. I would just take everything as entertainment. It's kind of like the old political radio of the 90s. If you take it seriously, you might start having some problems. If you take it as entertainment, you're probably going to do okay for yourself. So just keep that in mind on everything. Anyway, let's talk about IU. So Indiana, it was a weird situation with Indiana when they played Oregon this past weekend. And by the way, thank you, Patrick, for that comment. What if the new coaches, the friendships are made along the way? We've tried that before. It hasn't worked because none of us stayed friends. I'm also going to change this font. We need a better. Let's pick out a better font for theming here. There you go. That's a little too metal, I think, right there. That's a little too foofy. For those of you who are following along, we're going to land. Let's do this. Noto Sans. That may not be the best option, but we'll go with that for the moment. Anyway, let's talk about what happened with Indiana this week. They played Oregon. They lose that game. Now, a lot of people had talked before that game about, well, if Indiana wins that game and loses the Ohio State game, they'll be fine. Or if they lose the Oregon game and win the Ohio State game, they'll be fine. But maybe they'll need to win a game in the Big Ten tournament. So this is where I think everybody needs to be a little bit cautious, because many people, once Indiana went on that little win streak, beat Purdue, beat Michigan State at Michigan State, they ended up being in a position where it looked like, oh, they're going to be in fine shape now. And a lot of people, myself included, put Indiana in their brackets. Any reputable bracket is going to be produced based upon the results that have happened up to that point and not anything beyond that, because you can't anticipate what's going to go on in the future. And so at that time, I think, yes, Indiana, especially after picking up the wins that they did, winning 3 out of 4, they had really worked themselves into a position where they were in pretty good shape. And, that Washington win, it was more important that they didn't lose the game, but the fact that they won by the margin that they did made their power ranking look better, got them up in Ken Palm. Like, those were important things. Losing to Oregon in and of itself wasn't damaging, because losing at Oregon was what the computers expected was going to happen to Indiana in the first place. It wasn't a game that they were expected to win. Would have been great if they had, but it itself did not hurt Indiana. What hurt Indiana was some of the results that have happened since that point. And this is where, the hardest thing for bracketologists to get across to people is that this is a lot of moving pieces at once. And so you can look at that game and that Oregon-Indiana game and say, well, no big deal. They lose a game that they were expected to lose, but that shouldn't affect their tournament appearance possibilities. And yet, also in the same night, Texas beats Mississippi State on the road, a much-needed win for Texas. That got them a lot closer to being in. Georgia beats South Carolina. Arkansas with a big win at Vanderbilt, a game that they were not favored to win. And you had a couple of other results like that. That ended up hurting Indiana, not because Indiana did anything wrong, but because those other teams did something right that got their resumes more in line with everybody else. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Before we get to that point, I did want to note, and I meant to do this at the start of the podcast, I'm sorry I didn't, but Luke Hayworth chiming in. Great win for the women Hoosiers today as they knock off Oregon. Tough game tomorrow against USC, but I think they're in the tournament. I agree. I think the projections more or less are right on the women's team, probably somewhere in the 8-9 range, maybe 10, but I'm thinking more 8-9. And certainly if they play well against USC, that'll solidify that, and they should be in really good shape. So another good season for Terry Moore and her crew, a rebuilding season in a way, and certainly a season where they've had a lot of injury issues. But hats off to the ladies for their really solid win today against Oregon, and the best of luck in the early game tomorrow as they'll take on USC, who's obviously very good. So anyway, Indiana puts a good game together against Oregon, can't finish it off. Now, what I'm going to do, for those of you who have watched some of our shows in the past, I'm going to be calling up a set of spreadsheets. So if you're allergic to Excel, or if you've seen enough of it at work, I'm sorry. There's only so many ways that I can do this. But if you look at Indiana, I'm going to call them up. We're going to talk through what their resume looks like, and then we're going to talk about some others. Like, for instance, Braden in the comments asked if I could explain Georgia's profile. I actually can. There's others that I want to look at as well, but I wanted to give a sense to everybody where Indiana's at right now, what they've done that's been effective, and what they still need to do. So let me call this up first and foremost. You should be able to see this. So Indiana right now 18-12 on the season, and they are possessors of 4 quad 1 wins. You can see those right here in the mix at Michigan State, at Ohio State, Penn State in a semi-road game, but it still counts as a road game. And then they have that Purdue win. They also have 4 quad 2 wins, 2 at home, 1 in the Bahamas versus Providence, and then the game at Washington. They don't have any bad losses. No tier 2, no tier 3, no tier 4 losses. If you look at where Indiana ranks overall in terms of some of their metrics, this is where it gets a little bit too numbery for some people, but I think it's important you all understand this is the data that the selection committee is looking at. So Indiana right now against tiers 1 and 2 is 8-12, which is fine. 8 wins against tier 1 is pretty good. 4 road wins and 1 neutral win. The tournament selection committee does look at how you perform away from home because, as we know, you're not allowed to play home games in the NCAA tournament unless you're Duke or North Carolina. Those are the only 2 teams that get to play games at home. Everybody else has to play on a neutral site. If you look at the metrics for Indiana, 55th in the net, which is in range. It's low, but it's not abnormally low. WAB, which you can see right there, is wins against bubble. That's a rating that looks at how well you perform. As it's a metric. If you go to Torvik, it's on Torvik. It's hard to explain in a straightforward manner here, but it essentially rates every game and talks about, like, an average bubble team would win that game or lose that game. So that's what that is. Indiana fairly good there. Strength of schedule for Indiana, 32nd in the country, which is fine. And non-conference strength of schedule doesn't matter that much in this case. Their resume numbers. Now, this is where people get confused. There's really 2 different metrics you want to look at. Resume numbers in terms of what you've done on the season. So not counting the future, not trying to predict anything, just what you've accomplished, where do you rank? So in KPI, which is a pretty standard historical resume accounting, Indiana's 34th. That's good. 49th in strength of record, SOR. You might remember that from the football season. That's okay. You really want that to be in the 40s or better. And then JNG is the nitty-gritty report, which is put together by a friend of mine named Joby Fortson for hoopshd.com. This is a really accurate computer prediction of who gets in the NCAA tournament or who doesn't. Indiana is in the tournament at 43, but they're pretty low on the list of at-large teams. So these are all important numbers. And then you've got your predictives, which is like KenPom. And the whole idea of KenPom, for those of you who don't know, like all those numbers on KenPom are meant to allow you to take two teams and say, well, this team's power rankings and this team's power rankings in terms of what they've accomplished on a neutral floor or elsewhere, here's how they would perform against each other. So you can see Indiana 46th in KenPom, and that's where that Washington game really helped because they beat their opponent by a lot more than they were expected. Torvik, which is this TR thing, they're 55th, which is a bit low, and then BPI has them at 51st. So I show you all of this because, A, I think it's important to understand like the underlying numbers, but B, I think it's important to also grasp that there are teams that Indiana is competing against that are very different in terms of how their profile looks, but are not necessarily in worse shape. And this is where I think we get a disservice done by a lot of the national media organizations that cover these things, because all they focus on is like quad one wins, and quad one wins are important, but they're just one factor and they don't necessarily outweigh other factors. So Braden's question about Georgia, I'm going to pop Georgia up here on this side. I got VCU up here. We're going to come back to VCU in a minute because they're a really good example of an off-brand profile that is very much in competition with Indiana for potentially an at-large. So let's look at Georgia. So think about the numbers we just looked at with Indiana, and then think about what we're looking at here with Georgia. And what you see is that Georgia and Indiana look a lot alike when it comes to the number breakdowns. So Georgia right now 19-11, Indiana's 18-12. Georgia's got 8 wins against tier 1 and 2. Well, so did Indiana. Georgia's got 5 road and neutral wins. Indiana's got 6. Georgia's got a better strength of schedule overall, 15th. They're better in terms of wins against bubble. They're better in the net by about 22 spots. If you look at their resume ratings, you can see between KPI strength of record and nitty-gritty report, they're averaging out to about a 37, which is better than the 42 that Indiana averages out to. And then you come over and you look at the predictives. Georgia's predictives, BPI, Torvik, and KenPom, average out to about 34, whereas Indiana averages out to about 51. So you look at the wins, and again, as we talked about, the wins are important. We don't discount them. Indiana has 4 wins against the net top tier 1, and so does Georgia. Now, you could make an argument that Indiana's wins are a little bit more impressive in that the top 2 wins Georgia's got are both at home. They've got Florida back on about a week ago, and then they beat Kentucky earlier on in the year. And that actually accidentally called up the Florida team sheet. So let me get this back up again. We got Florida and Tennessee. Let me get Georgia back up here again. Sorry about that. So what happens when I click buttons? I shouldn't be allowed to do that. You look down at the tier 2 wins. They've got 4 there as well. The one thing holding Georgia back a little bit is a 1-point loss that's tier 2, but that is right on the borderline of being a tier 1 loss. If Mississippi State wins a couple more games, that'll probably be a tier 1 again. So you look at Georgia and you look at Indiana, and I think the tendency's been to look at Georgia and say, well, they're an inferior record to Indiana, and yet when you go down the list, it's not really the case. They're very similar to each other. What separates Georgia from Indiana and why I have Georgia ahead of Indiana right now in my ranking of teams is that their predictive numbers are better and their resume numbers are better. So both what they've done in totality as well as what they are projected to do based upon how they perform, Georgia's a better team, and they're almost equal in all of the categories that you would look at to try to evaluate that in other means, for instance, by quad 1 wins or quad 2 wins or where your losses are. So that's hopefully a good explanation for everybody about how a team like Georgia's resume works the way that it does. And That's going to make, I think, for a really interesting weekend, and even into next week as well, because there's a bunch of teams that are very close to each other in terms of how they come across within these things. We had some questions here. I'm gonna take the screen share down for just a second so I can address some of the questions. So JD asked, have the expanded conferences changed the rules about potentially playing conference opponents in the second round? Saw a projection of IU and Michigan State in the same cluster. Possible or lazy projections? So they have had to change those rules a bit, because you got to keep in mind, like originally when there weren't mega conferences, there are 8 sub-regions in every region, or in the totality of the NCAA tournament, as I think most people are aware. You've got your East region, and then you've got 2 sub-regions, and then you get your South region, 2 sub-regions under that, Midwest and West. So the bracketing rules were always invented to try to keep teams apart from each other until they got to the Final Four from the same conference. And the only time you would break that is when you had more than 8 teams, because at that point you couldn't separate them all out into their own subregions. So right now, there are 10 Big Ten teams in my projection for the tournament, and there's 13 SEC teams. It is almost impossible to prevent the possibility of a couple of second-round matchups. Now, I'll say that I tried to go out of my way to avoid second-round matchups unless I know when I'm doing the bracketing that the 2 teams have only played once on the season. So it may be lazy bracketing, or it may just be somebody actually following procedures, JD. I'm not totally sure, but it's an interesting question, and you're going to see some of that. And then, like, again, with 13 SEC teams in the big dance, there's no way that you're not going to have at least a couple of second-round matchups if both teams win. So that would be what I would say on that. It's a good question, though. And then that's actually, I think he asked the same question twice, but that's how that works. And so, I mean, I had a projection, I think my most recent one, which I didn't publish today because I'm only publishing the projections every other day. I had Ohio State and Oklahoma in a play-in game. They would play Memphis in the first round, and then they would play the winner of Wisconsin, Northern Colorado in the second. So that's how that might end up working. And I think it's going to be important to keep that in mind, because you don't want to face a Big Ten opponent, but if you've only played a team once, you're going to at least have the opportunity to play them again, maybe even in the second round. All right, so let's get to a couple other questions and comments here. If you have questions and comments, feel free to throw them on the YouTube channel. I can put them in that way. I'm also checking Twitter to get some comments as well. Tim Foster asked, when will the Big Ten tournament draw be revealed? Good question. That's one of the things we wanted to talk about. So the Big Ten tournament draw, the bracket is already ready to go. We know what the bracket's going to look like, and now it's just a matter of plugging the teams in. That won't be decided until we get to the end of the games this weekend. So I'm going to call up another item here. I shared this on the Back Home Network Discord. This is a cool little website that somebody's been maintaining for years, the Big Ten Tournament Tiebreaker website. So what it does is it basically takes all the remaining games, calculates all the tiebreakers, and figures out who's going to be seeded what. So, for instance, we've got coming up tonight, you've got Michigan State, Iowa. Tomorrow is Illinois, Purdue. Michigan State's favored to win against Iowa. We're going to say Illinois knocks off Purdue. Why not, right? Then over the weekend, UCLA, USC. UCLA is projected to win that. We'll say that they do. Indiana, Ohio State. For the moment, I'm going to keep it on Ohio State, but I'll switch it back here in a second. Maryland, Northwestern. I like Maryland in that one. Wisconsin, Penn State, the same. I'll take Wisconsin. I'll take Michigan State to clinch the outright title against Michigan. I'll take Nebraska over Iowa. I'll take Rutgers over Minnesota at home, and I'll take Oregon on the road. If I calculate seeds based on that, this is what we get. These 15 teams here would be the teams that would make the Big Ten tournament. And the way that the Big Ten tournament splits out, the top four teams get byes: Michigan State, Maryland, in this case, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That's a heck of a top four. That's a great season for Maryland, by the way. Then you'd have your next three who would be awaiting teams that won out of the Wednesday games. So Purdue, UCLA, and then Illinois. The 8-9 also play starting on Thursday, but they play each other because that winner goes and plays the 1 seed. So in this case, with this scenario, it would be Oregon taking on Ohio State, who would finish 10-10. Then you've got 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, which would be the teams that would play on Wednesday. And the way that it works is 10 would play 15, 11 would play 14, and then 12 would play 13. And the thing is, we're not going to know what order this is until all the tiebreakers are played out. So, for instance, like if we come back, if Indiana wins that game, but let's say USC upsets UCLA, and let's say Michigan pulls off the upset against Michigan State. Well, now, it's a different look, isn't it? So now we've got, just based on those two changes, you've got a top 4, slightly different order: Michigan State, Michigan, Maryland, Wisconsin. You've got Purdue as the 5, Illinois as the 6, UCLA as the 7. You've got Oregon, Indiana, because Indiana would finish 10-10. Ohio State would finish 9-11. USC jumps all the way up from 15th to 12th with that win, and that would make Ohio State, Minnesota, Rutgers, Northwestern, and then USC, Nebraska. So these are some of the things that we're looking at in terms of the seeding. We won't know that until the games are done this weekend, but we'll know immediately as soon as all of that finishes off in terms of where the orders sit. Kent asked, how much did IU losing by 9 to Oregon rather than 2 points due to IU's issues the last 2 minutes impact KenPom numbers? I would say probably not by that much. Oregon was actually favored to win that game by 6. They won the game by 9. That's not a huge difference in terms of the overall outcome. So maybe Indiana, they might have lost a spot in that, but it wasn't as big of an impact as it might have been otherwise. So, the end of game issues were frustrating, but, overall with Indiana, I don't think that it made that much of a difference. And, this is one of those things where it's hard to measure individual KenPom impacts based upon one game or another. This is where I like going to Torvik and looking at the wins against bubble metric. Indiana in that game, the way they played that game ended up being a 0.4 in the wins against bubble aspect, which was still fine. It was not nearly as damaging, say, as losing at home to UCLA was overall. So, Indiana overall in that Oregon game, the biggest problem they had in that was they didn't get to the free throw line, largely because the calls sucked. And also they didn't turn Oregon over defensively, and they let Oregon grab a ton of offensive rebounds. But in terms of the actual outcome, the way that they played was kind of statistically around the median. That's not going to have a huge impact on their overall rating. And I think even in Torvik, I think they only dropped like 3 spots with that loss. They might not have dropped any spots if they had won the game, but whatever. So anyway, Patrick asks, maybe I'm being a little too much of a conspiracy guy, but I think you'll see winner of Ohio State, IU, and Dayton for the last 4 in. So I think you might see both teams, Patrick, actually. And I'm going to show you that here in a second. But as he said, both would be big draws. IU sold out that game a few years ago. Tons of Hoosiers also draws eyeballs. I don't think there's any question, but I don't think if Indiana ends up in Dayton, it's not a conspiracy. I'm not saying you're saying that it is, but a lot of people will, when they say like, "Oh, they're gonna put Indiana in Dayton," that may be just where Indiana lands. Same thing with Ohio State. These two teams are very similar in terms of what they bring to the table resume-wise. They've got some warts. I'm going to show you that in just a second. Alex also noted earlier on that Oklahoma beating Missouri last night did not help Indiana much at all, and that's true. All right. Let's go look at Ohio State, Indiana. Let's look at a couple of these comps for Indiana, because I think it's important for everybody to understand like what we're sailing into in terms of this next weekend and the things that IU fans need to be rooting for. So let me go over to back to the team sheets. So here we are. We've got Indiana up on one sheet. We've got Georgia up on the other. Let's put Ohio State up because I want you to see why Ohio State's in the mix despite having a worse record than Indiana. So if you look at Ohio State, there's a couple things that stick out immediately. First of all, only 17 wins, but that's only one less than Indiana. Same record in conference right now, same number of road and neutral victories. One more win against Tier 1 for Ohio State. Slightly better strength of schedule for Ohio State. Ohio State is 19th. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. Ohio State 19th in strength of schedule, and Indiana 32nd. Not a huge difference, but little things make a big difference in these. Ohio State's resume average, 44.3, which is slightly worse than Indiana. But Ohio State's predictives, which again looks at how you play every game and tries to project how you would play against an opponent on a neutral floor, Ohio State is about 15 spots better than Indiana. If you look at who Ohio State's won and lost games against, so Ohio State has 3 Tier 2 losses, although 2 of them are by 1 point in overtime, and one of those games was, of course, against Indiana. You look at the wins, they have a home win against Maryland, neutral site against Kentucky, at Purdue. Those are 3 really good wins. And, to some degree, it's like, well, Ohio State won at Purdue, Indiana won at home versus Purdue. But then you add in Ohio State's won against Texas, they won at USC, they won at Penn State. And you look at what they've done in terms of their, the losses that they've got, they're pretty much in the same boat as Indiana. It's just that they've had a few of these that are spilling over into Tier 2, but they're very much borderline losses in terms of that. So I say all this and I put all this together because one of the hardest things I've been dealing with is how do you rank these two teams against each other? This is where when you hear bracketologists talk about the idea that you really shouldn't look at head-to-head. This is why. Yes, Indiana beat Ohio State head-to-head. But the flip side of that argument is that Ohio State, had a bad night. The numbers over the course of the whole season and the total number of quad 1 wins would seem to indicate that Ohio State might be a better team than Indiana on average, even though Indiana beat them head-to-head once. Now, Indiana beating them head-to-head a second time would be a really good idea for Indiana because, again, you want to be able to get beyond the fact that Ohio State has these better numbers. If you can say, well, they've beaten Ohio State both on the road and at home, that's a good argument that can be made in saying, well, maybe Indiana's just playing better now in this last half of the season, and what we're seeing out of the predictive rankings is a holdover from what happened earlier on in the season for Ohio State. It's also one of those things where if Indiana beats Ohio State, they beat a team at home that's going to be a Tier 2 win. This won't even be a Tier 1 win if Indiana wins it because Ohio State at 36th in the net will not qualify as a Tier 1 win. But another Tier 2 win would be good for Indiana. And again, now you're 19 and 12. Ohio State 17 and 14. You have a 2-win advantage. And one of the things we've seen over time with the tournament selection committee, they do like to reward wins, like total number of wins. Sometimes even if those aren't necessarily quality wins, these two teams both have a lot of quality wins. One of the things that the bracket will do, and the committee will do, and if you haven't seen this board before, let me educate you. You've got your 31 automatic qualifiers. You've got your 37 at-large selections. The last 4 at-larges are the play-in game teams. What the selection committee does is once they've picked the 37 at-larges, and they add them to the 31 automatic qualifiers, they have to put them on what's called a seed list or an S curve. And that is what we're looking at here. And this is essentially a 1 to 68 ranking of all the teams in the field. So you can see here, and I'm really having a hard time with the 4th 1 seed right now. You've got Auburn, you've got Houston, you've got Duke, you've got Alabama. I'm actually probably going to move Duke above Houston in my next update. I might move Florida above Houston because Florida now has beaten Alabama and Auburn on the road. They've been really, really impressive, and they're kind of hot at the right time. But anyway, you kind of go down the list, and you can see my interpretation using these various factors of where everybody sits within this context. And you go down the list, and you can see like the yellow highlights are the play-in games. So right now, if you're looking at at-large rankings, the last teams in my field that are at-larges are as follows. We'll start up at the top of the 9 line. You've got Connecticut, West Virginia, Baylor, Vanderbilt. New Mexico in this scenario is not an at-large. They are the team that's leading the Mountain West. But this is important because let's say New Mexico loses in the Mountain West tournament. They have a resume that's good enough right now that would have them in the field even if they lose a game in the tournament and don't get the automatic bid, which would mean someone else got the automatic bid out of the Mountain West, which would spell problems for the teams further down the bracket, like Indiana. Oh, Utah State in this case is an at-large. I've got them there. We'll talk about their resume in a second. Georgia, who we've already talked about. San Diego State, then Arkansas. Arkansas is the last four. That's the last team with a bye, so to speak. Then you've got Ohio State, Indiana, VCU, who's an automatic in this, and we'll come back to them in a second. And then I have Oklahoma and North Carolina as my last two. And again, you're talking about teams with very divergent resumes. You get past North Carolina. North Carolina here is the last at-large. Now you're into the automatic qualifiers. UC San Diego, Drake, McNeese, Yale, and then you start getting into some of the smaller schools. So let's talk about these teams and what their resumes look like, why they're where they're at, in my opinion, and how they might affect Indiana. So we've already looked at Indiana. Let's look at Utah State. So what's Utah State got going for them? So we just called them up. So Utah State, again, if you look at just quality wins, like Q1 wins, they've only got two. They won at St. Mary's and they won at San Diego State. Both of those are good wins. Both of them happened in December, I'll note. Utah State, 23 wins against Division I. You don't count non-Division I wins in these. 9 wins against Tier 1. 10 wins in road and neutral. Strength of schedule 83, which is fine. Their resume numbers are all pretty good. They're 33rd in KPI. They're 36th in nitty-gritty. These are all better numbers than Indiana. Their predictives are kind of in the middle of things, but if you'll notice, if you average their 3 predictives out, they're at a 50. If you average Indiana's 3 predictives out, they're at a 50.7. So technically a little ahead of Indiana. And again, where Utah State essentially does themselves credit is that they don't have any bad losses. They have all Tier 1 and Tier 2. They have 2 good wins, and then they have 7 additional pretty good wins. And they haven't really stumbled at all throughout the course of the season. And all the power rankings say this is a pretty good team. So this is why I have Utah State ahead of Indiana. If you go to who was the next team on our board? Georgia. We already looked at Georgia. And this is where, again, it's not an apples to apples. So when I look at Georgia, I said they look very similar to Indiana. I like what Utah State has done because they've won away from home and they've got quad 1 wins away from home. And I think that's going to resonate with the committee, along with the fact that Utah State's already won 23 games, whereas Indiana's only won 18 so far. Let's go to Arkansas, which is a team that's confounded a bunch of people and is a really hard team to peg. Arkansas, who's really been kind of the butt of a lot of jokes, has got a better resume than people think. Same record as Indiana. 5 road and neutral wins, so not as many as Indiana in that category. 7 wins against Tier 1. Strength of schedule of 20. Their resume numbers are slightly better than Indiana, and their predictive numbers are better than Indiana by about 7 spots. They've won at Kentucky, at Texas, at Vanderbilt now, Missouri at home, and at Michigan. Now, where the question mark comes is they've got 3 Tier 2 losses. Indiana doesn't have any. Generally speaking, I found the committee is more likely to reward wins as opposed to punishing losses. And so that's where I would look more at what Arkansas has been able to accomplish. I think they've got a big game this weekend. On Saturday, they have to take on Mississippi State. They win that game. It's only a Tier 2 win because it's at home, but it's another big win for them in terms of it's a quality win. It's a Tier 1, Tier 2 win. They'd have 8 wins against that group if they pulled that one off. Let's go to San Diego State, who's also, maybe in more trouble than people realized at first. Now, they have 19 wins against Division I. The trump card that they have is they have 3 wins that are really good against teams that are in the field or close. Neutral court against Houston, which is nuts to think that San Diego State beat Houston earlier this season. Neutral court against Creighton, and then they win at Boise State pretty sizably. They do have a Tier 3 loss, which is problematic. Really, decent resume numbers. Their predictives are not as good as Indiana's. 9 road and neutral wins, 8 wins against Tier 1 or 2. I don't know how the committee weighs these two. Because then you get right down to it, if you're going off of quality of wins, you can make an argument that, the 8 wins that San Diego State has against Tier 1 and 2 are about the same that Indiana's got against that same group. And you could argue that San Diego State has the best win out of that entire group with that win against Houston. You could also argue that Indiana's got the better win because they won at Michigan State. This is where committees will oftentimes argue over these things. We already talked about Ohio State, and I think that was the other team I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about the two teams below, because this is where it starts to become a little more problematic in terms of figuring out which teams are a danger to Indiana. So if we look at Oklahoma, big win against Missouri last night, which gave them a much-needed fifth quad one win, which is one more than Indiana's got. So now Missouri, despite only having 5 wins in conference play, 9 wins now against Tier 1 and 2. Only 6 wins road and neutral against opponents this season, but a strength of schedule of 13. And if you look at their resume and their predictives, they average out to being a bit ahead of Indiana overall, but not by much. They're very close to each other. And again, what hurts Mizzou is that loss that they had at home to LSU, which is just an inexplicable loss for a team that's otherwise a pretty high-quality team. But this at least kind of looks like Indiana's resume. Where I think we're going to start to run into trouble is how does the committee decide that they're going to tackle North Carolina? So, look at North Carolina. They have 1 win against Tier 1 in the entire season. It was a 2-point win against UCLA in a neutral site. Now, they do have 6 wins against Tier 2, barely. That game at North Carolina State is right on the borderline of being a Tier 3. They have a Tier 3 loss, albeit by a point, to Stanford. But you look at their overall resume, they've only got 7 wins against Tier 1 and 2, 20 wins overall. Strength of schedule is 48th, which is, fine. But this is where it gets interesting. So the resume between Indiana and North Carolina, they're about the same. Indiana's averages out to a 42. North Carolina's averages out to a 46. Predictives, however, Indiana's averages to a 51. North Carolina's is a 35. So what that means, again, is that the committee looking at this could be saying to themselves, well, the ACC was weak this year, but North Carolina played based upon their predictives with the quality of a team that is, about 35th in the country, which is about a 9-10 seed level of quality. And Indiana, despite having a few more wins, on the whole, has played worse than that, has played around the 50th best team in the country. I do worry that a North Carolina team with 20 or 21 wins or 22 wins, even if they don't beat Duke this weekend, the committee may look at them and say, well, they played a really tough non-conference strength of schedule. They're 5th in the country in non-conference strength of schedule. They tested themselves. They did the best, that you would expect, given that they didn't have a lot of opportunities to win games in conference that mattered. They played Auburn on a neutral floor, played Florida on a neutral floor, played Alabama at home, played Michigan State on a neutral floor, played at Kansas. I just feel like they're going to find a way to get North Carolina in now that they've gotten to the 20-win mark, as long as they don't do something foolish like lose to a horrifically bad team in the ACC tournament. So this should be a little bit of a concern to Indiana because, even though I've got North Carolina in the mix, others don't. Where do they end up landing? I wouldn't be shocked if North Carolina wasn't even in the play-in games, if they somehow got an 11 seed without being in the play-in games. A similar thing happens with Boise State, where you look at Boise State and they only have 2 quad 1 wins. St. Mary's in a neutral site, and then they beat Clemson earlier in the year at home. Boise State, 21 wins against D1, 9 road and neutral, 6 wins against Tier 1 and Tier 2, which is not ideal. Resume averages out to 52. Predictives average out to about 45. I'd argue in this scenario, if it was a last spot between Boise State and Indiana, I'm guessing Indiana gets the nod simply because their resume is a bit better. It's a little too close for comfort. And so that's something I want everybody to keep in mind is you've got teams like this, or Xavier's another one that I keep seeing in people's fields, where you look at Xavier, they're bereft of top-level wins, but they've got 9 wins against Tier 1 and Tier 2. Their predictives are right in line. They're 39th in the country. And resume-wise, they're right around where Indiana is. So these are kind of the danger marks. And again, it's like Xavier doesn't have any bad losses either. They're not that dissimilar from Indiana. The only difference is Indiana's got those quad 1 wins and Xavier does not. But you can argue that Xavier might have a slightly better depth of a success overall simply because they've racked up slightly more wins against the top half of the field. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, As we get through all of this, I've had a lot of questions about who should Indiana root for over the course of the next couple of weeks. So if you look at the conference standings, there's really only a couple of places that I would say Indiana needs to be really concerned about, but there are some. So first is going to be involving UC San Diego, which is a team I talked about earlier. This is the Big West standings. You can see UC San Diego's up here at the top. 16-2 in conference. They can win it outright. And they just have to sweep the games this weekend. At this point, I don't know that UC San Diego would make the field, but it's hard to ignore the 35 in the net and the 36 in KenPom. I could see a scenario where you get UC San Diego into the Big West title game. They lose that to, say, UC Irvine, who's another really good team that's in the top 65 of the net, and they go ahead and put UC San Diego in. So you want to root for UC San Diego in the Big West tournament. The rest of the conferences, at least the under the radar conferences, there really aren't teams that are that would be potential bid stealers. The one exception is Drake, who I know everybody's been talking about for coaching search reasons. But if you look at Drake, I don't think that they're getting in without winning the Missouri Valley Conference, even though they're 17-3 in the conference. But they're 59th in net. They're 61st in KenPom. They don't have the resume. They haven't beaten any teams of note. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. I don't think you need to worry about whoever wins the Missouri Valley. I think that's the only team coming out of the Missouri Valley. You might make an argument for McNeese, but I don't think McNeese has the resume to not win the Southland and still get in as an at-large, because they would have lost to a pretty bad team en route. Now, the major conferences are a different story. So let's talk about these in a little more depth. These are the teams that Indiana really, and the fans at least, really need to root for. Let me get this zoomed in properly. Hold on a second here. There we go. Okay, let's start up in the American. Let me get this up here. Okay, so you can see they've got one team that's pretty highly ranked, and that is Memphis. Memphis is going to get in. Memphis is, even 48th in the net and 49th in KenPom. They're 25-5. Their strength of record is 15th. They are solidly in the field. You do not want Memphis to lose in the American tournament because North Texas is not getting in any way other than winning the conference title, and the rest of the teams are pretty bad. So Memphis is a team you need to be pulling for as you move forward. In the ACC, you need to be rooting for one of Duke, Clemson, Louisville, I guess maybe North Carolina, if you accept that a North Carolina team with as our commenter WJH said here, a 20-win North Carolina team is a lock. It's North Carolina. So you could probably root for them to win the ACC. You don't want SMU or Wake Forest or Stanford or Georgia Tech or anybody like that winning the ACC title, because all those other teams are getting in. SMU, some people have talked about. I don't see their resume as adding up to being a tournament resume at this point. So that's not a team you want to see win the ACC. It'd be hilarious if it happened and somehow SMU swept both the ACC basketball and football titles. I would be thrilled at that. I guess they lost to Clemson in the ACC title. They came close. They were at least in the conference championship game. VCU, we talked about. I don't know if VCU makes it in if they don't win the Atlantic 10, but let's just not mess with that. Let's just have them win that conference, because the rest of the teams are not going to get in. I want to go back to something that Caleb Boggs said here. North Carolina 1-10 in quad one games. That's true. They are 1-10 in quad one games, but their overall numbers are going to impress the committee. Because ultimately, like, what you get with a lot of these teams is they don't have a ton of quad one wins. And so you can't just use quad one as the end all be all of how you're going to judge these teams. Even though I think as IU fans, given that IU does have 4 quad one wins as of now, you would prefer that we just use the quad one. Let me type this in to learn how to spell Carolina properly here. So you can see, yeah, they've got 1 win and they've got those 10 losses, but then they've got 7 quad 2 wins. And again, and this is where I hate the quad system, because the margins are just dumb. It's like you've got you win against Pitt at home by 1 point. It's a quad 2 win. You lose this Wake Forest game, and that's a quad 1 loss. It's just like there's a lot of weirdness in terms of the numbers don't necessarily line up in terms of how good the teams actually are. It's a very arbitrary system. I hate arbitrary cutoffs and statistics, and that's what you get with the quads, which is why the committee doesn't just focus on those numbers to the exclusion of everything else. If we go back and sorry, let me go back to this here. In the Big East, you want to root for St. John's, Creighton, Marquette, or Connecticut to win that conference. Again, Xavier's a kind of a maybe, and Villanova is not going to make it in otherwise. We had a question here from Richard. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a team like Colorado State winning the Mountain West Conference is a disaster for Indiana with two at-large teams. 100%. Let me skip down to the Mountain West. We'll talk about that. So right now, I'd say there are three Mountain West teams that will legitimately get in on their own accord right now: New Mexico, Utah State, and Boise State. Colorado State right now would not be getting in of its own accord. Their net is too low. They're too low in Ken Pom and whatnot. They don't have the resume to make it happen. I think Boise State right now is on the outside looking in. But it is very, very possible that Colorado State or Boise State or even UNLV could win the Mountain West, which would probably lead to a fourth team coming out of the Mountain West. That's the bid stealing that you're talking about, and that is problematic. In the Big 12, again, you want to root for one of those top 8 teams, anybody from Houston through West Virginia, because when you get to TCU, Kansas State, these are teams that frankly are capable of winning the Big 12. I don't think they will, but if they were to win, that would take a bid away because all these other teams are getting in, like all top 8 teams there are getting in. And then the last conference I would really focus on would be the West Coast Conference, where you've got two teams that are very clearly going to get in on their own accord, St. Mary's and Gonzaga. They'll be in regardless. San Francisco would not be, but again, I wouldn't be shocked to see San Francisco winning the West Coast Conference. And the fact that it's a neutral court tournament this year rather than being played on Gonzaga's home floor or whatever makes that a possibility. So again, you want to root for St. Mary's and Gonzaga in that tournament there. One of those two teams needs to come away. Where Indiana's at right now, I will put it like this. Like if they lose to Ohio State, they really do make their road hard because they're kind of auto-locked at that point behind Ohio State, in my opinion, in the pecking order. Do they end up at that point behind, a North Carolina? Do they end up behind an Oklahoma? Do they end up behind a Boise State or somebody like that? They lose the opportunity to move further up. And, the problem is the margins are so thin at this point with Indiana against these other teams that when you look at Xavier, if Xavier, wins their game this weekend and then goes on, a little bit of a run, maybe at the beginning of the Big East tournament, does that have an effect in terms of putting them in and maybe putting Indiana by the wayside? So I look at it like this. Indiana winning against Ohio State is incredibly critical because it gives them another quad 2 win. It gives them 19 wins going into the Big Ten tournament. It makes them 10-10 in the Big Ten. It's really hard to leave out a team that goes 500 in the Big Ten. Even with the lack of other quality wins that Indiana's got, they would have, enough there, I think, that they would make it in no problem. You lose that game, and this is where you really start to get dicey because now you're in the conference tournament. And I've seen a lot of people saying, well, Indiana have to win a couple games in the conference tournament. And I would just warn everybody that what history shows us is that the conference tournaments are not really looked upon as that important by the committee. They say every game counts, but they really do seem to judge the full regular season. And if there's any impact of the conference tournaments, it's normally minimal. Indiana's been through this in Mike Woodson's first season. If you'll recall, they kind of stumble into the Big Ten tournament. They had that big comeback against Michigan. Before that Michigan game, everybody's like, we think Indiana's in. It's kind of dicey, but we think that they're in at that point. I know I was doing brackets. I think I had them as an 11 seed, but they were clear of the play-in game at that point. They beat Michigan, who made the tournament. Then they beat Illinois. Illinois was a 4 seed. They were a protected seed. And then they lose to Iowa on that ridiculous Jordan Bohannon shot. Well, you would have thought, wow, they beat 2 teams that made the tournament. They beat a protected seed in the Big Ten tournament. Surely that moved them up to like a 9 seed, maybe a 10. No, they were in the play-in game. It basically had no impact at all. And you see that in a bunch of different conferences where conference tournament just don't have much of an impact with teams that are on bubbles. Teams that from a seeding line perspective, we see teams go on runs in conference tournaments and maybe move up one seed line or not at all based upon how they're playing. The only time we really see major movement, I remember the best example of this is probably that the Kemba Walker UConn team, who was kind of on the bubble going into the Big East tournament that year. They win 5 games in 5 days. And they end up as a 3 seed, which everybody was like, well, they're way overseeded based upon that. And I think they ended up winning the national title. So they clearly were not overseeded. But it's very rare that you go on a run in a conference tournament and it makes that big of a difference. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the conference tournaments, like the field's essentially locked with the exception of auto bid stealers by Saturday about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Like at that point, they're bracketing, they're seeding, they're doing all the things the selection committee has to do in that process. So as a doctor, my prescription for Indiana is just go beat Ohio State this weekend. Don't rely on the conference tournament to bail you out because it's probably not going to. And I would give that same advice to, Texas. I'd give that same advice to Xavier. I'd give that same advice to, I would have given it to Northwestern, but they ended up losing last night. I think to Maryland, if I'm not mistaken. No, they got Maryland this weekend. Any team that's on the bubble, don't expect the conference tournaments to save you because they're probably not going to save you. So where does Indiana end up? I mean, right now I've got them back in Dayton. I've got them playing North Carolina in one of the play-in games. We'll see how things land tomorrow, but that's where I've got them at right now. So we did have a question I wanted to go back to from Russ Baxter. If Indiana misses the tournament, I hope they don't accept an NIT bid. Like, why would they do that? Well, it's not just the NIT, but you've also got this new tournament, the Crown, which some of you have heard about and forgot. I forgot about it until a month ago, but it's this new kind of competitor tournament to the NIT, which Fox is doing, which locks in the non-qualifying teams from the Big Ten, and other big conferences that Fox is contracted with. Would Indiana participate in that if they missed the tournament? I doubt it. I mean, they skipped the NIT last year as well, and teams are increasingly doing that. And you have to keep in mind that the portal opens the Monday after the opening weekend of the NCAA tournament. For a lot of teams, if you're not in the NCAA tournament, you get zero benefit from hanging around and playing in one of these lesser tournaments. So it's going to be interesting to see how Indiana deals with that. And I would be surprised, especially given that a coaching change is in the offing, for them to participate at all. Richard asks, what is the theory that the committee has about not counting neutral floor conference championship games, especially if a bubble team beats a 5 or better seed in the field on a neutral floor? I've never heard an adequate explanation because the committee never really directly comes out and says that they're not counting those games. And yet every year we see them not particularly count those games. If I had to put it into a theoretical perspective, we've seen a lot of good teams kind of half-ass the conference tournaments because they want to stay fresh. Tom Izzo did this for years, right? Michigan State would get in to the Big Ten tournament, they'd lose in the first round, they'd get extra rest, and then they'd go to the Final Four. We've seen one-off, and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier in the podcast about why we don't overemphasize head-to-head when it comes to these tournament evaluations, because one game, a one-off game, especially one on a neutral floor, is ultimately not a great test of how good a team is. And I think, Richard, you're right. Like, on the one hand, if a bubble team beats a 5 seed, it's like, wow, that bubble team might be really good. It might just be one game. And I think that, the committee overcorrects, but maybe justifiably so, on the idea that why would we overemphasize the most recent games, the conference tournament games, when we have an entire 30 to 32 game sample size from that same team that demonstrates that they may not be as good as they were that one particular day. It is ironic that that's what they're doing as they go into a single elimination tournament, where how you look on one day is what matters more than anything else. But that would be my explanation. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I am saying that that's probably how they're thinking. Alex noted about the NIT stuff, a shame, because I love they moved the NIT semis and finals to Hinkle after MSG kicked them out. Would have loved for more teams to opt in. I mean, on the positive, it did give us Indiana State in the NIT final last year, and that was certainly a fun experience for everybody that ended up going to that, and certainly was a fun game and a fun run to watch on television as it happened. So anyway, I think that's all we've got for now. I really do appreciate the questions that people have sent in, and I really do appreciate the overall like thought process that people have with these things. It's really, I'm glad Indiana's in the conversation, at least. Like, this is the thing I was worried about. Last year sucked because it was clear that Indiana wasn't going to make the tournament, and it's hard to get that excited for it. I'd love it if Indiana was firmly in the field, but at least we've got something that's captivated everybody's interest here as we head into the last week of the season. Indiana's got to win on Saturday to really feel secure. And I think if they beat Ohio State, they're going to be in regardless of what happens in the Big Ten tournament. But if they lose to Ohio State, it's going to be a really, really touchy next 9 days, or 8 days, I guess it will be, as we figure out what happens. Anyway, I hope this was a good live chat with you all. I hope that you got something worthwhile out of it. We'll do another one of these early next week as we figure out what the Big Ten tournament setup is going to look like and who's playing who and when Indiana's playing. Hopefully we won't see Indiana until Thursday of the tournament, because that'd mean they've got the 9 seed and beat Ohio State. So hopefully you're going to be out at Assembly Hall or somewhere out watching and cheering on the Hoosiers as they take on the Buckeyes this weekend. And we'll see what happens. If there's any other coaching search news, well, we'll try to cover that as well, but in a responsible manner, of course. Anyway, thanks to all you folks for joining, and we'll look forward to catching you on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.